Cold open. The gallery lights were still warm on the canvas when a stranger in a gray wool coat walked straight past the wine table, straight past the artist giving her opening night speech, and stopped in front of the small, unassuming landscape my mother had left me 11 years earlier, the one my husband had called attic clutter for a decade. The stranger didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she took out her phone, photographed the lower right corner of the canvas, where a tiny, half-faded signature sat beneath years of yellowed varnish, and said quietly to no one in particular, "This can't be here." Within 40 minutes, I would learn that the painting I had been storing in a garage for 11 years, the one my husband had tried, twice, to convince me to sell to a friend of his for $800, had been reported missing from a European museum's collection for over 60 years. And within 4 months, I would learn something considerably harder to hear, that my husband had known exactly what it was for at least 3 of those 11 years, and had built an entire quiet, patient plan around making sure I never found out before he did. Welcome to the quiet inheritance, where ordinary people face impossible betrayals, and prove that the strongest response isn't always the loudest. Every story ends with a lesson, a reckoning, or a victory worth waiting for. My name is Wren. I'm 41. I restore historic textiles for a small conservation studio, and up until that Thursday evening in a gallery, I'd only agreed to attend as a favor to a friend. I believed the painting hanging in my garage, wrapped in an old moving blanket behind a shelf of paint cans, was worth exactly what my husband had always told me it was worth. Nothing much, sentimental value only, a faded landscape my mother had liked for reasons nobody else in the family ever fully understood. If you've ever discovered that something you were told was worthless had, in fact, been quietly, deliberately hidden from you for years by the person who claimed to love you most, stay with me. Comment where you're watching from, and subscribe, because what I found out over the following 4 months is not the story anyone in that gallery expected, least of all me. I have to take you back 11 years, to the week my mother died, to explain how a painting nobody in my family thought twice about ended up at the center of everything. My mother, Adeline, was a quiet, private woman who spent the last 15 years of her life in a modest bungalow 2 towns over from where I grew up, filling her days with gardening, church potlucks, and an ongoing, mostly good-natured argument with my father, before he passed, about whether the small landscape painting hanging above their fireplace was actually any good. My father always said it was amateur work, probably bought at some flea market decades earlier, before either of them could remember exactly where or when. My mother disagreed, gently but consistently, for as long as I knew her. "There's something in it," she used to say, standing in front of it with her arms crossed, studying the muted greens and grays of what looked, to my untrained eye, like an ordinary European river scene, small boats moored along a stone quay, fog settling over rooftops in the distance. "I don't know what it is, but there's something in it." I never asked her, while she was alive, where the painting had actually come from. I regret that now more than I can easily articulate. What I know, pieced together later from an old estate ledger, and a handful of faded letters I found going through her things after she died, is that my maternal grandmother, Odile, had emigrated from a small city in Central Europe in the years immediately following the Second World War, arriving with almost nothing beyond a single trunk of belongings, among which, apparently, was a rolled canvas she had, according to one surviving letter to a cousin. "Carried out with me because I couldn't bear to leave it, though I know I shouldn't have taken it at all." I did not, at the time I first read that letter, think much of that specific phrasing. I filed it away, the way you file away an odd detail from a grief-fogged week of sorting through a parent's belongings, without examining it too closely, and the painting came home with me, wrapped in an old moving blanket, destined, I assumed, for eventual placement somewhere in our house once I found the right wall for it. I want to be honest about what actually happened to that plan, because it matters considerably for everything that came later. My husband, Desmond, took one look at the painting the week I brought it home and told me, with the particular confident dismissiveness I would only later come to recognize as a consistent pattern rather than an isolated opinion, that it was not really our style, that the frame was cracked, and the canvas itself looked kind of grimy, honestly, and that we should probably just store it somewhere until I decided what I actually wanted to do with it. I agreed, mostly because I was exhausted from grief and had no particular emotional attachment to the painting's aesthetics myself, only to the fact that it had been my mother's, and it went into the garage, behind a shelf of paint cans and gardening tools, where it remained, largely forgotten, for the better part of a decade. I want to describe our marriage, briefly, as it existed during those years, because I think the shape of it matters for understanding how thoroughly I trusted Desmond's judgment on something like this without a second thought. We had married 9 years before my mother's death, after meeting through mutual friends when I was in my late 20s, working, then as now, as a textile conservator for a small studio that handled restoration work for regional museums and the occasional private collector. Desmond worked in commercial real estate appraisal, a career that meant he spent his days evaluating the actual market value of properties, buildings, sometimes entire portfolios. And I had, for years, genuinely respected his eye for value, the specific professional confidence he carried about knowing, quickly and accurately, what something was actually worth. It never once occurred to me, during those years, that the same professional skill set that let him accurately price a commercial warehouse might also let him recognize, considerably more precisely than he ever let on, exactly what was hanging in my garage. Twice over the following decade, Desmond raised the subject of the painting again, always in the same casual, practical register he used for most household decluttering conversations. The first time, roughly 4 years after my mother's death, he mentioned that a colleague of his, a man named Preston Voss who dabbled in buying and reselling estate art as a side hobby, had seen a photo of the painting on Desmond's phone. A photo Desmond had apparently taken himself at some point without my particular awareness, and had offered, generously in Desmond's telling, to take it off our hands for $500, basically as a favor, since it's honestly not worth much more than the frame it's in. I declined, mostly out of a lingering sentimental attachment to something that had belonged to my mother, rather than any specific sense that Desmond's assessment of its value was inaccurate. The second time, roughly 3 years later, Preston's offer had apparently risen to $800, an increase Desmond attributed to Preston, just being nice, honestly, since the thing's been sitting in a garage getting dustier every year. I declined again, for the same reasons, and the conversation didn't come up a third time, largely, I understand now, because Desmond had stopped needing it too. I did not think about that painting again, in any serious way, until the week a close friend of mine, a ceramicist named Bettina Ichterberg, invited me to the opening of a small group show at a gallery downtown, a modest, community-focused space that hosted rotating exhibitions of local and regional artists, alongside occasional loans from private collections for context and comparison. Bettina had asked, weeks earlier, whether I had any old family pieces I might be willing to loan for a section of the show focused loosely on inherited and found objects. A curatorial theme she described, with characteristic enthusiasm, as basically just an excuse to get people to bring in weird old stuff from their attics and see what happens. I mentioned, half joking, that I had a slightly grimy old landscape painting sitting in my garage that had belonged to my late mother, and Bettina, delighted, asked if she could include it. I said yes, mostly because it felt like a small, meaningful way to finally do something with a piece I'd been storing for 11 years without ever quite deciding what to do with it. And because I liked the idea of my mother's painting, however modest, being seen by people again instead of sitting in the dark behind paint cans. If you've ever handed over something you believed was ordinary and watched a stranger's face tell you, instantly, that you were wrong, you already know exactly the kind of vertigo that took hold of me standing in that gallery. Stay with me, because what happened over the following 40 minutes is only the beginning of what I eventually learned. Hit subscribe so you don't miss where this goes. The woman in the gray wool coat, I learned within minutes of her stopping in front of my mother's painting, was named Ingrid Solheim, a visiting provenance researcher affiliated with a European Cultural Heritage Foundation, in the country for an unrelated conference, and attending the gallery opening as a personal favor to a colleague who knew Bettina. Ingrid explained, once Bettina had introduced us and I'd confirmed, somewhat bewildered, that yes, the painting was mine, that she recognized the composition almost instantly from a database of artworks reported missing or looted during and immediately after the Second World War. A database that, she explained gently, provenance researchers and museum curators across Europe consult routinely when evaluating unfamiliar pieces, precisely because so many works, taken under chaotic wartime and post-war circumstances, still surface, decades later, in unexpected private collections, estate sales, and occasionally small community gallery shows exactly like this one. I want to be honest about what I felt in that first conversation, standing in a gallery with a glass of wine going warm in my hand, listening to a stranger tell me, calmly and carefully, that the painting I had spent 11 years believing was worth, at most, $800 to a hobbyist collector, was very possibly a documented missing work by a regional European landscape painter whose surviving pieces, when they occasionally surfaced at auction, had sold for sums considerably higher than $800, considerably higher, in fact, than almost anything else I owned. I felt, primarily, a kind of dizzy disbelief, the specific sensation of having an entire decade of assumed ordinary reality quietly rearrange itself in the space of a single conversation. Ingrid was careful, throughout that first conversation, not to overstate her certainty. I need to see it properly, under better light, and photograph the signature and any labels on the back of the canvas or the frame, she told me. This happens more often than people assume. A painting resembles something in the database, and it turns out to be a coincidence, a later copy, a different artist entirely working in a similar regional style. I don't want to alarm you unnecessarily. But I also don't think you should sell this, or let anyone else handle it, until we know for certain. I gave Ingrid my contact information before I left the gallery that night, and drove home in a state of distracted, half-formed thoughts that I did not, yet, fully understand the shape of. It was only 3 days later, sitting in my car outside my own house after Ingrid had called to schedule a proper viewing of the painting at my studio's conservation lab, where I had access to better lighting and equipment than my garage could offer, that a specific, uncomfortable memory surfaced, unbidden, the way memories sometimes do once your brain has finally been given permission to reconsider something it had previously filed away as unimportant. I remembered, with a clarity that made my stomach drop, a conversation from roughly 3 years earlier, not long after Preston Voss's second offer of $800, in which Desmond had mentioned, almost in passing, that Preston had gotten someone to look at some photos of it just out of curiosity, and that the assessment had come back. Pretty much what we figured decent regional work, not anything special, worth maybe what Preston offered, if that. I had believed this completely at the time, the same way I had believed every previous assessment Desmond had relayed to me about that painting, because I had no independent reason, then, to question it, and because I trusted, implicitly, that my husband would not lie to me about something as small and seemingly inconsequential as the value of an old family painting neither of us particularly cared about. Sitting in my car outside my own house, 3 years later with Ingrid Solheim's careful, measured warning still fresh in my mind, I began, for the first time, to ask myself a question I had never once thought to ask before. What if that assessment 3 years earlier had not, in fact, come back? Pretty much what we figured. What if Desmond, or Preston, or both of them, had learned something considerably more significant about that painting, and had simply decided, for reasons I did not yet understand, not to tell me? Ingrid examined the painting properly 4 days later, in the controlled lighting of my studio's conservation lab, using a handheld UV light and a jeweler's loupe to study the faded signature in the lower right corner, the specific texture of the canvas weave, and a small, partially obscured label affixed to the back of the frame that I had, in 11 years of occasionally glancing at the painting in passing, never once thought to examine closely. What she found, over the course of nearly 2 hours of careful, methodical study, was, in her words, considerably more than a coincidence. The signature, once cleaned of surface grime under careful magnification, matched letter for letter, stroke for stroke. A documented signature style belonging to a regional landscape painter active in the decades before the war, whose surviving body of work, considerably diminished by wartime losses, was catalogued meticulously by the same Cultural Heritage Foundation Ingrid worked with. The partially obscured label on the back of the frame, once photographed and enhanced, revealed a fragment of text and a partial inventory number consistent with pre-war museum accession records from a small regional gallery that had, according to historical documentation Ingrid was able to access within days, reported a significant portion of its collection missing or unaccounted for in the immediate chaos following the war's end. Records that had, for decades, simply listed the missing works as presumed lost, rather than actively, publicly searched for, given the sheer scale of wartime losses across the region and the limited resources available for provenance research in the decades that followed. "I want to be careful about how I say this," Ingrid told me, sitting across from me in my studio's small break room, the painting laid flat on a padded table between us. "Because provenance cases like this can take months, sometimes years, to formally resolve, and I don't want to give you false certainty before the proper research has been completed. But based on what I'm seeing here, the signature, the frame label, the documented gap in this painter's cataloged works from exactly this period, I believe there is a strong likelihood that this painting is one of the pieces reported missing from that regional collection after the war, and that it made its way out of the country in the hands of someone who, like your grandmother, was fleeing under circumstances that left very little room for careful documentation of exactly what they were carrying with them." I sat with that information for a long moment, turning over, in my mind, my grandmother's own faded letter, the one line I'd read years earlier and filed away without examining too closely. I carried it out with me because I couldn't bear to leave it, though I know I shouldn't have taken it at all. I understood, sitting in that break room, that I was very possibly looking at a painting my grandmother had taken, under wartime chaos and genuine desperation, from a collection that had every legal right to eventually reclaim it. A painting that had sat in my family's possession for over 60 years, entirely without malice, simply because nobody had ever known or asked exactly what it actually was. I want to be honest about the complicated, layered nature of what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. I did not feel, primarily, possessive anger at the idea that this painting might ultimately need to be returned to a museum or foundation with a legitimate historical claim to it. I felt instead a kind of sobering, expansive curiosity about my own family's history that I had never previously had access to, alongside a growing, considerably more troubling question that had nothing to do with the painting's ultimate rightful home and everything to do with what, exactly, my own husband had known, and for how long, while telling me repeatedly that it was worth $800 to a hobbyist collector. I asked Ingrid directly whether it was possible to determine when, precisely, the painting's true significance might have first become discoverable to an ordinary person conducting a casual assessment, rather than a trained provenance researcher with access to specialized databases. She considered the question carefully, then told me that while identifying the specific painter and frame label required exactly the kind of specialized knowledge and database access she had, a considerably less rigorous assessment, one conducted, say, by an art appraiser with general expertise, but without her specific provenance research background, could plausibly have identified the painting as belonging to a known, catalogued painter's body of work, and could have, at minimum, flagged it as worth significantly more than $800, simply based on the documented market value of that painter's other surviving pieces, without necessarily uncovering the full missing artwork provenance question at all. I want to walk you through what I did next, because I think the specific, methodical texture of it matters more than any single dramatic confrontation, the same way it has mattered in every story I've ever told on this channel. I did not go home that evening and confront Desmond immediately. I understood, sitting in that conservation lab with a painting that might belong, rightfully, to an institution on another continent, that I needed to understand the full shape of what had actually happened before I let myself react to any single piece of it. I found the name Preston Voss, Desmond's colleague who had made both offers over the years, and I did what I have learned, across a career of careful, patient restoration work, to do whenever I need to understand the true condition of something before touching it. I looked closely, methodically, for whatever record of his actual involvement might exist. I found, first, that Preston Voss did not, as it turned out, work in commercial real estate alongside Desmond at all. A fact I confirmed with a simple, direct search that took considerably less effort than I expected, and that made my stomach drop for the second time in a single week. Preston Voss, according to his own public professional profile, worked as an independent art and antiques appraiser, with a specific, advertised specialization in European regional paintings from the 18th and 19th centuries. Precisely, unmistakably, exactly the kind of expertise required to recognize, immediately and confidently, exactly what my mother's painting actually was, and exactly the kind of expertise Desmond had, for years, described to me only vaguely. As some guy I know who buys estate art sometimes. I sat with that discovery for several days before deciding what to do with it, turning it over carefully, the way I turn over a fragile textile before deciding exactly where and how to begin a restoration. I did not, in those first days, immediately assume the worst possible interpretation. I told myself, genuinely trying to be fair, that there might be an innocent explanation, that Desmond might simply have misremembered or misrepresented Preston's actual profession in casual conversation, without any deliberate intent to mislead me about the painting's value. I wanted, I think, to give my marriage the benefit of a doubt I had never previously had reason to withhold. That benefit of the doubt lasted until I found, going through old email records on our shared household account while looking for an unrelated document, a message thread from 3 years earlier that I had never previously had any occasion to notice, buried in a folder of forwarded home maintenance receipts neither of us checked with any regularity. The thread was between Desmond and an email address I did not recognize at first, until the signature block at the bottom of one message identified it, plainly, as Preston Voss, Fine Art Appraisal Services. I read that thread standing in my own kitchen, the way I had read a similarly damning thread in a previous chapter of my life that I won't repeat the details of here, and I want to tell you honestly that some part of me recognized, even before I finished reading, the specific, sickening shape of what I was about to find. Preston's first message in the thread, dated 3 years earlier, read, in relevant part, "Had a closer look at the photos you sent. This is legitimate, Desmond. I'd need to see it in person to be fully certain, but based on the signature style and the composition, I believe this is a documented work by the painter's name, and pieces of his that have surfaced at auction in the past decade have sold in the range of $40,000 to $60,000, sometimes higher depending on condition and provenance. If you can get her to sell it to you cheap before she has any reason to get it properly appraised, I'm happy to help place it with a serious collector afterward for a finder's fee. Let me know how you want to handle this." I read that message perhaps 6 times before I could fully absorb its meaning, standing in my kitchen with my phone in my hand, the same kitchen where, in a previous chapter of my life I will not repeat here, a different discovery had once rearranged everything I believed about a different marriage. Desmond's response, sent the following day, read, "Let's give it some time. She's sentimental about it because of her mom, so I don't want to push too hard too fast. That'll make her suspicious. I'll keep floating low offers over the next year or two, and eventually she'll cave, especially once enough time passes that she's forgotten it's even in the garage. Once it's actually mine, we split whatever you can get for it." I stood in my kitchen for a long time after reading that exchange, feeling something considerably colder and more complicated than the straightforward vertigo I'd felt in the gallery watching Ingrid photograph the painting's signature. This was not a story about a husband who had simply, innocently misjudged the value of an old family painting. This was a story about a husband who had known, with specific, documented $40,000 to $60,000 precision, exactly what that painting was worth, 3 full years before I ever brought it to a gallery, and had spent those 3 years deliberately, patiently, methodically working to convince me to sell it to him for $800, waiting, in his own words, for me to simply forget it was even in the garage. If you've ever discovered that a small, ordinary dismissal, it's not worth much, honestly, had actually been a carefully constructed lie sustained over years, you already know exactly the kind of cold, focused clarity that takes hold of a person in that moment. Stay with me, because what I found out next about Preston Voss's actual plans for that painting is considerably worse than the underpayment scheme alone. Subscribe now so you don't lose this before I tell you what happened at the museum. I did not confront Desmond that evening, and I want to explain why, because I think the reasoning matters. I understood, standing in my kitchen with a 3-year-old email thread now fully absorbed, that confronting him immediately, without complete information, would give him exactly the opportunity Preston's original message had counted on, the opportunity to manage, minimize, and reframe a deliberate, documented plan into something he could later characterize as an innocent misunderstanding, a joke taken too far, a favor to a friend that had simply gotten out of hand. I had, by that point in my life, learned enough about how these conversations tend to unfold to understand that the strongest position I could occupy was one built on complete, verified information, gathered calmly and methodically, before I let a single confrontation begin. I contacted an attorney, a careful, precise woman named Adeline Reyes-Baptiste, who specialized in art and cultural property law, a considerably more specialized field than I had any previous occasion to know existed, recommended to me by Ingrid Solheim once I explained, carefully, everything I had discovered about Desmond and Preston's original scheme. Adeline reviewed the email thread, the painting's documented history as Ingrid had established it, and the timeline of Desmond's repeated lowball offers over the years, and gave me an assessment that reframed the entire situation in terms I hadn't fully considered. There are actually 2 separate, serious issues here, she told me during our first meeting, and I want to make sure you understand both clearly. The first is the marital and financial issue. Your husband and this appraiser conspired, over a documented period of years, to deliberately misrepresent the value of an asset that legally belongs to you, with the explicit goal of acquiring it from you at a fraction of its actual worth. That's a serious breach of trust, and depending on how you ultimately want to handle your marriage, it has real legal implications for how any eventual divorce or asset division would need to account for this painting and the schemes surrounding it. The second issue, considerably larger in scope, is the provenance question Ingrid has raised. If this painting is confirmed to be a work reported missing from a European collection after the war, there are established international legal frameworks for restitution claims that will need to be navigated, regardless of what happens with your marriage. And I want you to understand that those 2 issues, while connected, will likely need to be handled somewhat separately. I asked Adeline, directly, what she thought Desmond and Preston's actual endgame had been, beyond simply acquiring the painting cheaply. She was quiet for a moment, then told me something that added an entirely new, considerably more troubling dimension to everything I already knew. I'd want to look more closely at exactly how Preston Voss intended to place it with a serious collector afterward, as his email put it, she said. If this painting genuinely has the kind of documented, potentially contested wartime provenance Ingrid is describing, then any sale to a private collector, conducted quietly, without proper provenance disclosure, would itself raise serious legal questions, potentially even criminal ones, depending on jurisdiction, if it could be shown that Preston knowingly facilitated the sale of a work he suspected or knew might be subject to a restitution claim, without disclosing that possibility to either the seller or the eventual buyer. Working with Adeline over the following 6 weeks, alongside Ingrid's continuing, increasingly confident provenance research, I began to understand the fuller shape of what Preston Voss's business, fine art appraisal services, had apparently been quietly built around for considerably longer than my own painting saga. Adeline's own investigative work, conducted through public auction records, and a handful of careful, professional inquiries to colleagues in the art law field, surfaced 2 prior instances, over the preceding 8 years, where paintings Preston had appraised for private clients. Clients who had, in both cases, sold the works to him directly at prices considerably below what Preston's own subsequent auction placements ultimately achieved, had later been flagged by other researchers as having documentation gaps consistent with unclear or potentially contested wartime provenance, gaps that Preston, in both instances, had apparently never disclosed to either the original sellers or the eventual buyers he'd placed the works with. I want to be careful, here, about the line between what was ultimately proven and what remained, even after considerable investigation, a strong but not fully conclusive pattern. Adeline was emphatic, throughout this process, that we needed to be precise about what we could actually document versus what merely looked suspicious, and I have tried, telling this story, to maintain that same precision. What was fully documented, beyond any reasonable dispute, was the specific scheme involving my own painting, Preston's original email establishing his knowledge of its true value, and Desmond's explicit, written agreement to patiently manipulate me into selling it cheaply, followed by a planned profit split once Preston placed it elsewhere. What remained a strong, troubling pattern, but not something I could claim with the same certainty, was whether Preston's broader business had involved similar schemes with other unsuspecting sellers over the years, potentially involving other works with equally sensitive, undisclosed provenance histories. I made a decision, roughly 7 weeks after that first gallery opening, about how I wanted to handle both dimensions of what I'd discovered, and I want to walk through that decision carefully, because I think it reflects something I've come to believe, across every version of this kind of story I've ever lived through or told, about the difference between revenge and simply insisting, calmly and completely, that the truth be known. I did not confront Desmond in some dramatic, public setting, the way certain stories tend to resolve themselves for maximum spectacle. I confronted him privately, at our kitchen table, on a Tuesday evening, with Adeline's advice fresh in my mind about documenting the conversation carefully, and with the printed email thread laid flat on the table between us before he'd even fully sat down. I watched his face change as he recognized what he was looking at, and I want to describe that change honestly, because it was not, unlike a certain painting's discovery, an instant, dramatic collapse. It was slower, more guarded, the particular expression of a man doing rapid calculation about how much I actually knew before deciding how to respond. "Wren," he said, finally, "I can explain that." "I'd like you to," I said, and I meant it genuinely, in the sense that I wanted to understand, as fully as possible, exactly how he had justified this to himself across 3 years of quiet, patient manipulation, even while understanding that no explanation was likely to change what I already intended to do next. What he offered, over the following 20 minutes, was not, in the end, a denial. It was a series of justifications that grew progressively weaker as he offered them, that he genuinely intended, at some point, to eventually tell me the painting's true value, that the plan had been more Preston's idea than mine, honestly, that he'd told himself, at various points over 3 years, that I didn't really care about the painting anyway. It was just sitting in the garage. A claim that struck me, hearing it, as a particularly hollow attempt to retroactively justify deceiving me about something specifically, because it had emotional significance connected to my late mother. I told him, plainly, once he'd finished, exactly what I intended to do. I was filing for divorce, with Adeline representing me, and the documented scheme he and Preston had constructed would be part of the formal record establishing exactly how the painting's true value and provenance history had been deliberately concealed from me for financial gain, a fact that would matter considerably for how any asset division was ultimately determined. I also told him, because I believed he deserved to hear it directly from me rather than through legal correspondence, that I intended to fully cooperate with Ingrid's ongoing provenance research and any resulting restitution process, regardless of what that ultimately meant for the painting's monetary value to either of us, because I had come to believe, over the preceding weeks, that the painting's rightful home mattered considerably more to me than whatever it might eventually be worth at auction. I want to tell you about the resolution of both threads of this story, because I think they matter in different ways, and because I don't want to leave either one unfinished. Ingrid's provenance research concluded, roughly 4 months after that first gallery opening, with a formal, thoroughly documented finding. The painting was, conclusively, a work reported missing from the regional collection Ingrid had originally suspected, taken from the country amid the genuine chaos and danger my grandmother had fled under, 60-some years earlier, in circumstances that historical researchers, reviewing the full documented context of that period and region, described, with considerable compassion, as understandable rather than malicious, even as the painting's rightful ownership remained, legally and ethically, with the institution it had originally belonged to. I made the decision, working with Adeline and the foundation Ingrid represented, to formally return the painting, a decision I want to be honest was not, in the end, a particularly difficult one for me to reach, despite its considerable financial implications. The foundation, in recognition of both the painting's safe preservation across 60 years and my full, immediate cooperation once its true history became clear, offered a modest but genuine goodwill payment, considerably less than the painting's full auction value would have represented, but a sum I found, honestly, more meaningful precisely because it came without any of the deception Desmond and Preston had built their own plans around. I used a portion of that payment, along with proceeds from the eventual divorce settlement, which Adeline successfully argued should account for the documented scheme's attempted fraud, to fund a small, ongoing scholarship administered through Ingrid's foundation, supporting young provenance researchers doing exactly the kind of careful, patient historical work that had, ultimately, told me the truth about my own family's history that a decade of my own casual assumptions never had. Preston Voss's business came under formal investigation roughly 6 months after my own divorce proceedings concluded, once Adeline's earlier pattern research, combined with my own documented case, was formally referred to state authorities overseeing licensed appraisers. I do not know, as of this recording, the full resolution of that investigation, which remains, according to the last update Adeline shared with me, still active. What I do know is that his appraisal license was formally suspended pending the investigation's outcome, and that at least 2 of his prior clients, once made aware of my own case through subsequent local reporting, have come forward with questions about their own past dealings with him. I do not see Desmond anymore, beyond the occasional, brief, businesslike correspondence our attorneys' offices still require from time to time as final settlement details continue to be processed. I think about him, honestly, less than I expected to, in the months since our divorce finalized. What I think about more often, sitting some evenings in my studio, working on considerably less dramatic textile restoration projects that nonetheless carry their own quiet satisfaction, is my grandmother, carrying a rolled canvas out of a country in genuine chaos because, in her own words, she couldn't bear to leave it, though she knew she shouldn't have taken it at all. I think about my mother, standing in front of that painting for years, insisting, gently, that there was something in it nobody else could quite see. I think about how right she was, in a way none of us, including her, ever fully understood while she was alive to say it. Here's what I learned, sitting some evenings now in my studio with a considerably smaller, considerably more honestly appraised collection of family objects around me. People can look at something precious, something with real, documented worth, and tell you, patiently, repeatedly across years, that it's nothing much, specifically because convincing you of that is the entire foundation of a plan they've already built, quietly, around acquiring it for themselves. But truth, like a signature buried under decades of yellowed varnish, does not actually disappear just because someone has spent years insisting it isn't there. It only needs the right light, eventually, and the right person willing to look closely, to become undeniable again. If you've ever been told, patiently and repeatedly, that something precious to you was worth nothing, by someone who had every reason to know better, this story was for you. Do one thing for me this week. Whatever the painting is in your own life, an inherited object, an idea, a piece of work only you could have made, have it properly, independently assessed by someone who has no reason to benefit from telling you it's worth less than it is. Comment, the one who found the signature, if you made it to the end with me. Share this with someone who's ever been quietly underestimated about something that actually mattered, and subscribe to the quiet inheritance, because there's always another gallery, another stranger in a gray coat, and another truth waiting patiently under the varnish for someone willing to finally look closely.